Always on. Thinking eyes see intensely, actively, skeptically. Scan globally, focus locally, see at varying scales of space and time. Approximating ways through multiplicity, detecting how things happen, move, act, interact. Seeing with fresh eyes. Vacation eyes. Unhindered by self-confirming words, models, expectations, not seeing something different is not seeing anything at all. The most dangerous phrase in the language is, we've always done it this way. That's some free verse from a book by Edward Tufte recently called Seeing with Fresh Eyes. And I really like that idea, seeing with fresh eyes. Here in biology, we're in the business of being biologists and making new biologists. So we need to ask the question, how do we make the best biologists? Among other things, I believe the best biologists are able to see with fresh eyes, meaning a person who is able to constantly renew her perspective, to recognize and check her biases, and to examine biology from unusual and unexpected angles. Biologists need to know things, that's true, they need knowledge, but biologists also need to be able to think, and to think in new ways. After all, biology, life, is by far the most complex system we've ever encountered. Understanding it requires complex thinking. So if someone were to ask, how does the James Webb Space Telescope work? Well, it's a really complex answer, isn't it? It involves engineering, physics, math, that kind of thing. But it's understandable to the point that humans can actually answer the question by building it, putting it into space, and using it to answer other questions. So no offense to my physics colleagues, but biology just isn't like that, is it? The kind of questions we want to ask are far more complex. Consider a similar question that says, how does a giraffe work? How does a giraffe work? The genetics, the epigenetics, development, phylogenetic history, physiology, microbiotic interactions, predator-prey relationships, herbivore-plant relationships, sexual strategies, social strategies, all of these factor together in incredibly complex ways. The answer to the question, how does a giraffe work, is almost impossible to answer, isn't it? Biology is shockingly complicated and often not reducible. After all, it even includes the human brain. It includes the human mind. It includes consciousness, the hard problem. I believe to truly answer questions in biology requires not only knowledge, not only critical thinking, but also a different way of thinking, creative thinking, imaginative thinking. To truly see with fresh eyes requires the ability to think anew, to think laterally, to imagine new connections and combinations that no one has yet considered. How do we encourage that? For years now, I've been assigning art projects in my science classes. My hope that in thinking artistically, creatively, and imaginatively, the students might gain a slight edge in understanding biological systems in new ways. Students have done painting, sculpture, cooking, dance, music in various ways, and other artistic endeavors in my class. I believe it's provided students an opportunity to engage biology in truly original ways. But even more than that, how do we want biologists to be? We want them to think critically, to think creatively and imaginatively. But I think we also want them to be a particular way. Biologists should be curious. Biologists should be motivated to learn. They should be learners. Among the best ways to stimulate learning about biology is to actually experience biology. Biologists, I think, should be experiential. They should want to do biology. To that end, over some time now, I've been developing experiential courses that bring students into contact with biology using the total of the human experience. Scientific thinking, but also artistic thinking, philosophical thinking, cultural thinking, psychological thinking. What better way to stimulate learning than to allow students to encounter biology using the total of the human experience? So some years ago, I began teaching experiential classes, and they culminated in an international course in Peru that incorporated both artistic and scientific understanding of biodiversity in a rich setting. I think the course was pretty successful, but COVID kind of shut down the next iteration of that course and attempts at similar courses until now. And so My co-instructor, Dr. Ernest Valdez, and I decided to ramp it up by, instead of going back to Peru and doing something safe, we would go to Kenya. We would go to Africa instead. What better place to encounter biology? So the goal of this trip was to provide an experience that would inspire curiosity and wonder in ourselves and in our students. We were hoping that this would be transformative, and I hope we succeeded. Our journey began here at UNM in the classroom. We met every week to discuss a variety of things. Our theme for much of our conversation during this time was the senses. After all, how do humans experience the world? We experience it through our senses, don't we? So we had a lot of conversations about that. How do humans experience culture? How do they experience science through the senses? So we engaged in activities and discussion about each of the senses, how it's used by humans artistically, culturally, to understand the world. And our plan was to be very intentional about our experience of the world through the senses, but also to better consider how other organisms use sense experience to interpret the world, to imagine how they might do things differently. Humans tend to experience the world visually. We're visual creatures. In fact, many of our metaphors about how the world is are visual. You see what I'm saying? But other animals don't, do they? For example, hyenas experience the world through their noses. They use smell. My dog does the same thing. And interestingly, of course, bats experience the world, the shape of the world, through sound, don't they? How might that be? How might we imagine that to be? And that was one of our goals, was to try to imagine things differently. And even though Nagel tells us we'll never know what it's like to be a bat, we can never subjectively experience that, we can imagine that, we can get close to it. And so part of our goal was to do that. And so with some preparation, we were off to Kenya. We had 7 students and 2 instructors, me and Ernie. And we left Albuquerque a few days after Christmas, so this was a fairly recent trip. A major component of any excursion such as this is, of course, the social aspect. That's one major element of science, isn't it? The relational aspect, the collaborations that we develop. And even in Albuquerque, we found that the students were beginning that collegial cooperation, that camaraderie and friendship. They brought this game, what was it called? Ecology or something? Yeah. They were already playing that in the Albuquerque airport. And I think from this point, we knew that we had a pretty special group. Our first adventure before the adventure was actually a 24-hour layover in Frankfurt, in Germany. We explored the city, we took in the culture. We had a wonderful dinner of schnitzel, of course. It wasn't schnitzel with noodles, I had schnitzel with potatoes. And it was amazing. It turns out that Essie, one of the students in the class, her family is actually from Frankfurt. So we met her aunt and her cousins, we went out to dinner with them and had an absolutely wonderful time. Despite the jet lag and the weariness from the flight, we all had a wonderful time. And this was one of the first major bonding experiences that the students had. And I think it was a really good time. Sorry. But then we were off to Kenya. Now, I should mention, before I go any further, that one of the main ways we got around Kenya was through the use of an organization called Africa. This is a group that specializes in custom safaris for educational purposes, and very much like what we intended to do. They met us at the airport and they were with us throughout the entire trip. Even though they scheduled much of the trip, we had a huge amount of autonomy. I told them that I wanted to be able to do our own curriculum, and they set it up so that we could do that. But they organized all of the lodging, the guides, the food that we ate, and other aspects of our trip. So very thankful to Africa for that. One of our first activities was organized by Africa. It was an orientation which included some education in Swahili as well, which was incredibly useful to us. After all, language is the way we communicate our experiences, isn't it? Language is the way we can categorize the world. It's the symbology that we use for the experiential biology that we were going to do. Having another language to try to do that in was really illustrative for all of our students, I think. So our first small adventure in Kenya was a day in Brackenhurst. Now this is a resort community, but it has a rehabilitated indigenous forest. So our first experience with the biodiversity in Kenya was at Brackenhurst. And it was an absolutely lovely place. And the students began experiencing biodiversity through the senses. They experienced Kenya through the senses. It's also the first place we saw monkeys. If you know me at all, you know I don't much care for primates. And so we had our first experience with monkeys there, Sykes monkeys. Sykes monkeys would come back to haunt us multiple times after this. This area had a large number of plants and animals that the students were seeing for the first time. They attempted to identify these. They started making lists of biodiversity at this point, taking pictures and that kind of thing. We also visited a neighboring tea plantation, which culturally is kind of fascinating. Tea is one of those drinks that changed the world, didn't it? And so Kenya is famous for its tea, and we got to see how it was grown, and our guide explained that to us. We also engaged in some of the activities associated with forest rehabilitation, including planting some trees. So we got to engage in some conservation efforts as well. The same day that we went to Brackenhurst, we engaged in another activity that was really a lot of fun. It was called a market challenge. So the students divided into two teams. They had a shopping list that they had to fulfill. They had a shopping list and a budget. They each had the same amount. And they had to go into the market and haggle for prices for produce. And the team that did the best at that would win. So they had a great time trying to do this. As you might imagine, this was kind of the first major exposure to Kenyan culture. If you've ever been elsewhere in the world, the markets are a vibrant place where there's a lot of activity. There's an opportunity to meet the local people, to engage with them, to have a good time with them. But also they got to see the biodiversity that exists in the market, which, you know, if you've ever been in the tropics, there's a lot of plants and even animals and other things in the market that we simply don't have here. It also was a great bonding experience for the students. They had to work together, to strategize together, and they did really well. I forget which group won. You're all winners. Oh, you won? I don't think you won anything, then, did you? Just notoriety. So this was day one in Kenya. We had a great experience. We stayed in a wonderful hotel in Nairobi, in Karen, actually. But then the next day we were off. We were off to our first major site, Impala. So our main site was Impala Research Center. We were intending to be there for 3 nights. Impala is a large game reserve dedicated to research activities. So this is not a tourist site. Impala is a very large property surrounded by other villages and their properties, and so it's a great place for wildlife, and a lot of science is going on there. I think it's a private organization, but I know it's supported a lot by Princeton and a couple other organizations as well. So we were destined to be there for 3 nights. Impala is in central Kenya. It's a brushland habitat. I should mention that the timing wasn't great for visiting Kenya. They're in a huge drought that's been going on for a long time. But I assumed that the big animals would probably still be there, so I thought it was a safe bet still to go to Impala. While we were there, I should explain that many of our activities included game drives, and we had these wonderful safari vans, these safari buses with tops that came up, and that's how we got around during the day. That's how we traveled all around. These were provided by Edu Africa. We had drivers that were dedicated to this who also were guides and knew the local wildlife. So we did daytime game drives, and we also did nighttime game drives. We would use a spotlight and look for eye shine and look for animals at night as well. And of course, we saw the amazing megafauna of the region. From elephants to various antelope species to hippos. Ernie and I finally saw hippos. We've been to Africa multiple times. I crossed the Mara River, I don't know how many times. I've never seen hippos. So finally, we got to see our hippos. But we also saw plenty of other animals. At night, we saw a lot of animals at night that we didn't see during the day, some that we did see, and of course it was harder to take pictures at night. But some of my favorites were a striped hyena. We saw an aardwolf, and my favorite one was we got a pretty good look at a leopard at night, which is really quite rare to see. Now I should mention, I put vision up here in Impala. We especially focused on photoreception as an experiential sense. What better place to explore crypsis and conspicuousness, shape, color, size and other aspects of visual sensory experience than a place like Impala. So we had a lot of discussions about that. We saw two different kinds of zebra, Grevy zebra and plain zebra. So now I've seen all three zebra species, which is kind of cool. We saw reticulated giraffe, dik-dik, kudu, many, many other species at Impala. I should mention though now too, that since we had Ernie along, we made special effort to experience interaction with bats. One of the main things we did the entire trip was focus on bats because we had a mammalogist who studies bats. This was our first night in Impala. We set nets near a very large roost. We had heard that there were bats nesting in the roost on the roof of this building. And so we set nets near this roost, and we caught several bats in a family Ernie had never collected before, right? I think that was a new family for Ernie. So that was pretty cool, and here they are, right? Is that them? Yeah. But even better than just catching bats with Ernie, it turns out that 5 of our students had gotten their rabies shots before we left, and so they were able to handle the bats. And so the first experience that these students had with handling bats in the field was this family that Ernie had never collected in Canada. That was a pretty exciting evening. I saw that some of them wrote in their journals that they could feel the heartbeat of the bat as they were holding it. That's pretty experiential. Impala was a full range of a great deal of biodiversity. We saw hyraxes, various primates, these are vervet monkeys, various reptiles, lizards, tortoises, and we got really close to a bat-eared fox. There was a den of these things, and we pulled up close and were very quiet, and they would periodically stick their heads out and have a look at us out of curiosity. And so we got some great pictures of bat-eared foxes. We saw them at night as well. I tend to forget about geckos until I'm in the tropics, but I love geckos. I love hearing them at night. There's something very comforting about geckos around. But we also saw a lot of different birds. Birds were a major component of the biodiversity everywhere we went. And so we were lucky to see a lot of different bird biodiversity. And of course, we focused on arthropods as well. These ants are called driver ants. Sometimes they're called safari ants or hissing ants. If you get close and you mess with them, they all stridulate a little bit and they sound like they're hissing. Okay? These are old world army ants, and what they're doing here is trooping back home after having gone and raided a termite mound. So they go and they capture the termites, gather them up, and haul them back to their colony to eat. So these are old world army ants. Our first night in Impala was extremely eventful with the bats, new family for Ernie, the students were handling them. We were pretty jet lagged and fatigued that night. Remember, we had just gotten into Kenya. And so the next morning, we told the students, you guys are welcome to hang out, sleep in. You don't have to be up here until later in the morning. We'll start our day a little bit later. But Ernie and I went in for breakfast in the morning, and we were there pretty early. And there was some commotion, and we found out that maybe we needed to change our plans. So we woke the students. Actually, a couple of them were there. We told them, go wake everybody up, tell them, get dressed, get their butts in gear, and bring their cameras. And so they all came up and met us within about 10 minutes or so, which was pretty good. We didn't tell the students what was going on as we drove out into the bush. We were just going to leave it as a surprise. And this is what we encountered. So during the night, a pair of male lions had brought down a buffalo right on the road, actually pretty much right on the road, and they dragged it just off the road. And so we showed up, and one of the lions was still feeding on the buffalo, and we were able to watch it for an hour or so. You can't imagine how many pictures and video were taken of this lion. Like 90% of the videos we have are this lion. But you can see this is an older lion, and apparently an older lion and this younger lion, this coalition, had brought down this buffalo, and we had the opportunity to watch the older lion take apart this buffalo for a period of time. Eventually it kind of wandered off, it had gotten its fill, and we were waiting around, and all of a sudden here comes a slender mongoose, which also started feeding on the buffalo. incredible treat. I mean, how often do you get a chance to see lions taking apart an animal that they had just brought down right off the road? But that was just in the morning. The day wasn't over yet. We had an opportunity to visit a local village. This is part of our cultural education in our experiential biology program. You're the instructors. I didn't join in. I had to. As you can see, the villagers met us with singing and dancing. The students got to join in. What an incredible opportunity. I think they finally kind of got the hang So we had the opportunity to meet the villagers. They explained their operation to us, the kind of challenges that they face as villagers in central Kenya. They talked a lot about how this village in particular is working to empower the women of the area. We also had a chance to look through products that they were making, beadwork, carvings, and other sorts of artisanal products. And of course, we dropped a bunch of money buying these products. But this was very special because we got to actually meet the artists who were making these products and talk with them about their art. And we became friends with the group and had a really wonderful time. So that evening, we went back to Impala, and that evening we decided to set up for bats in a different area. We found out that there had been bats roosting in this old outhouse, and so Ernie set up nearby. The students helped set things up. And we did, in fact, catch more bats. I think we got 3 or 4 bats, also of another new family for Ernie, and the students got to handle them. But we were interrupted that evening. Some of the rangers came back and told us that the lions had returned to the carcass. And so we assumed that the lions meant, the 2 male lions had returned, and we wanted to go see them again, obviously. But instead of just the 2 male lions, this is what we found. So the entire pride had come, 8 lions in all, including the large male lion that had helped bring down the buffalo. And so again, we had the opportunity to watch a pride of lions about 20 feet off the road, just to give you an idea how close we were. Here's Simon looking out from the van, and you can see the lions over there just off the road. One of the best shows I've ever had in my life. I'm pretty convinced the lions were on the payroll. Bravo, well done. Well done. Here you can see the large male lion off to the side. Now remember, the large male lion and that older male lion had eaten that morning already, so they were pretty full. Absolutely incredible experience. So our time in Impala included a lot of additional activities. We had extensive discussion about the senses, especially vision. We talked a lot about the biodiversity of the area, how the biodiversity uses vision in their own activities, photoreception in various ways. But ultimately, we had to leave Impala. So we were there, I think, for 3 nights, and then we left. We had a bit of a drive to get to our next destination. Our next site was Mount Kenya, which you can see is not terribly far away. It was like 3 hours or so to drive. And you can see Mount Kenya is a giant shield volcano. It's an old dormant volcano. And you can see at the very top, there's this very craggy, sort of nasty apex to it. Over 17,000 feet in elevation. And we were going to go to about 11,000 feet. And that's what we did. But before we got there, the students were never not trying to experience things. As we were trying to get into the park, the students began poking through zebra poo to find dung beetles. We also had a troop of baboons wander through. If you've never experienced baboons, it's a dark, dark world out there, folks. Yeah, these baboons were pretty rough. They really like to eat garbage, and they seem to like to pick at each other quite a little bit. Not very pleasant. But what a great experience to be able to do this. The site we were staying at on Mount Kenya was Old Moses Camp, which, as you can see here, is about 11,000 feet, 10,500 to 11,000 feet above sea level. Pretty rustic. Our conditions were pretty rustic. There was a building that we stayed in with bunks. It was very cold, very blustery. We were at 11,000 feet after all. But I think we had a great time. Tricky part, there wasn't a lot of toilet paper, as I recall. Oh wait, we just had to ask. Mount Kenya was absolutely gorgeous. The next day dawned beautifully, beautiful blue skies, and we had a wonderful time on Mount Kenya. Our focus on Mount Kenya was the sense of touch, tactile reception. Tactile sensation was particularly intense with the plants on Mount Kenya. Normally I tell students when we go in country, don't touch anything. Just don't touch anything. Put your hands in your pockets, sit on your hands. But on Mount Kenya, I told them touch everything. Try touching everything and see what it feels like. Different shapes, different textures, different heft, and especially with the plants. Throughout the trip, we engaged in specific activities to help us focus on the senses. On Mount Kenya, we did this activity. I just want to give you an example of one of these. I had the students gather up odd-shaped objects. They could be biodiverse objects, even man-made objects, and put them into an opaque sack. And then we got back to the facility, and they traded sacks, and they had to try to draw the object based only on feel. They had to feel the object inside the sack. That forces you to really pay attention to how something feels. You have to reproduce it through drawing. And I think it was a good activity. So our main activity, though, was a hike up the mountain on the one day that we were there the whole day to about 12,000 feet. And we experienced the biodiversity and the landscapes along the way. And these students were wonderful. They were exactly my kind of people. We made very poor time as we walked along. It was walk 3 feet, check something out. Walk 3 feet, check something out. Absolutely fantastic. And we did find animals. We found a number of arthropods and various groups and that kind of thing. But the main thing we discovered along our way were plants. I'm not a plant guy, but I really appreciated the plants on Mount Kenya. We did encounter animals. We saw a water buck, buffalo, and eland above the tree line at 11,000 feet. And we also heard bats up there, and we decided to try to capture the bats. We didn't have any luck capturing bats, but we did get at least one bird. And so the students had the opportunity to see a Mount Kenyan bird up close. And in fact, the bird life on Mount Kenya was pretty impressive. After 2 nights on Mount Kenya, we had a long drive back to Nairobi for one more night there. Along the way, we crossed the equator again. You can't quite read that, but it's an equator crossing. I don't know if you know, but Mount Kenya is right on the equator. We were at 12,000 feet at almost exactly 0 degrees latitude, which is pretty unusual and pretty experiential. The next morning, after we got back to Nairobi, which was a long drive, it was 6 hours, 7 hours, something like that, we went to Nairobi National Park. Now, if you don't know about Nairobi National Park, it's a very large national park. It's several miles by several miles right in Nairobi. And it's been a national park for forever. And so the animals that are there were the animals that were there from the beginning. But at the same time, it was a very different experience. If you've ever seen pictures of animals with the skyscrapers in the background, that's Nairobi National Park, and that's what we were seeing there. And we were there with a few thousand of our closest friends. It was a very tourist-oriented place. But even so, it was a great opportunity to see some animals that we hadn't seen yet, including things like crocodiles. We saw rhinos, white rhinos, ostrich, hartebeest, eland, up close and personal. So we saw some animals we hadn't seen yet. We saw Maasai giraffes. The ones in Impala are reticulated giraffes, a different subspecies, and they look a little bit different. And it turns out that zebras are pretty photogenic. We saw a lot of zebras and took a lot of pictures of zebras. I love these pics out here at the bottom, so cool. There was a crocodile swimming out just beyond these zebras, and every time now and then it would approach the zebras and get them very excited. I think the crocodile was pretty optimistic. We saw other creatures as well, including more hippos. If you can see here, there's some very interesting birds, crocodiles, hippos in this water hole, sacred ibis, impala, babies of various kinds. And we saw lions again. The lions were wandering among all of the tourist vehicles. And so it was a little off-putting, but it was fun to see lions again. So, but we were only in Nairobi again for a short period of time before we took off for the coast. The last place we were planning to stay was 5 nights down on the coast of Kenya. So we took a small flight to Malindi, and we were headed for another research station called Arusha. And so that's where we were going to stay for the next 5 nights. Arusha is right on the beach. So here's the porch, and here's the beach, literally a 2-minute walk away from the porch in Arusha. And of course, the first thing the students wanted to do when we arrived there was go swimming in the ocean. And swimming in the ocean here, fantastic. It's right on the equator. It was literally like bathtub temperature warm. Wonderful situation for swimming. The tricky part was getting them out of the water. One of the senses we focused on was chemoreception, and in particular taste, but also smell. So I want to mention the food real quick that we enjoyed in Kenya. Eventually I did get my Frankfurter in Frankfurt. It's up the upper left here. If we had been in Hamburg, I would have had a hamburger. We were in Frankfurt. But we did get a wide range of food. We ate very well. We included traditional food, but also somewhat less traditional foods as well. One of the coolest things we ate over there was called mandazi. These are basically sopapillas. And we learned that probably the sopapilla in the southwestern United States was inspired by mandazi. It probably arrived in southern Spain by way of the Moors coming from East Africa and then came to the New World. So we were eating something that was basically sopapillas, although we didn't have honey to go with it, so I don't know. Consistent with our investigation of taste, we found a wonderful community-owned seafood restaurant that was right nearby called the Crab Shack. This was community-owned. The fishermen in the community provided the food for the Crab Shack. And it was this beautiful site out in the mangroves, and we got out there right at sunset, and we were able to see the sunset. We had a lovely dinner there that evening. Some of us got the combination plate, which included a wide range of biodiversity from vertebrates with fish to, we had squid and octopus, so we had mollusks on there, and certainly arthropods. There was spiny lobster, prawns, and crab, and it was delicious. It was absolutely fantastic. We had a fantastic evening. So the arthropods, of course, that we were eating for food were inspired by arthropods that we were collecting as well. So we found a wide range of arthropods down by the coast, including giant African millipedes, weaver ants, mantises. The butterflies were fantastic, and there were plenty of ants, which is Ernie's favorite arthropod for sure. We also found some of the more creepy crawly arthropods, the non-insect arachnids, many of which were absolutely beautiful and exciting to find. I don't know if you know about net casting spiders, but we found these here, these little net casting spiders. They spin a little net that they use to capture prey items as they come by, and we found those as well. But another sense that we focused on the coast was the sense of sound. And you recall I mentioned talking about the idea of sound as it applies to bats, and I'm going to get into that. But we also explored the soundscape. Out in the forest, we tried to listen for the most distant sound and the closest sound. the loudest sound and the quietest sound. And we explored that soundscape from a human perspective, and then thought about what it would be like to be in that soundscape as other biodiversity. Because other animals use different hearing in different ways. And we're even finding now that plants can hear. They can hear herbivores nearby munching on other plants, and they can change their defenses based on that sound. So sound is used extensively out there. But we really wanted to look at sound in relation to bats. And so bats was a major theme of what we were experiencing in this part of Kenya. One of our most influential experiences in Kenya were the bat caves we visited. We visited 3 large caves, which of course were fantastic on their own. I love being in a cave. But these caves were especially interesting because of the bats. Hundreds of thousands of bats in these caves. And of course we were catching them. We actually used insect nets to catch the bats while we were in the caves. There were so many of them that we were able to catch them with nets. We found, I think, 6 species of bats in these caves and had one of the most dramatic biodiversity experiences of our lives. I want to mention 2 real quick, because I got to get an arthropod in here. We found bat bugs. These are huge rediviids that suck the blood of the bats. We found those in these caves as well. But obviously it was the bats that were the big story. It's really hard to capture the essence of this experience, but I want you to imagine being in a cave like this with bats swirling around you, these giant bats. They feel like they're giant because I'm used to moths bonking into them. They felt really big and they were bonking into us. I had one flop into my face at one point. But we were also catching them with our insect nets. And Ernie had quite the time, going around helping everybody get their bats out of their nets and that kind of thing. But if you can just imagine this experience, it's like nothing else I've ever personally experienced. It was definitely a highlight. While we were there, we actually drew the attention of a number of local people as well, including the children. By the time we were done, I think everybody had a kid attached to them. These kids would come up and hold our hands, and you can see the hand holding that was going on. Eventually, they actually came into the caves with us. Yeah. And they seemed pretty interested in the bats as well. This little girl, I think Kai, you have this one attached to you. Her expression there is so fantastic. That expression. She was very adventurous. So we feel pretty honored to be able to pass on this passion and curiosity about biodiversity to the next generation of learners. We hope we inspired some of them to continue on with that. Our guide for the trip was a gentleman named Kajango, and he took us to his village. One of the caves was on the property that his village was at. And he was a bat enthusiast, and so he was the perfect person to guide us here. Consistent with our experience of sound, we happened to be there on a Sunday, and we got to hear the churchgoers singing. I just want to play this for you. I thought their singing was just beautiful. So Kajango invited us to his home. They cut up some young coconut for us to drink, and the taste and the smell was fantastic. But I mentioned that Kajango is a bat enthusiast, and he and Ernie, I think, became best friends. I mean, these are like twins separated at birth kind of thing. I don't know if you can see, but Kajango had carved bats into his opuntia. Yeah, that's opuntia. And Natura, that was his name. But he and Ernie got along pretty well. I didn't catch it. So Ernie became known throughout the country as Baba Popo, which of course means Papa Bat. But he found another Baba Popo in Kajango. I think one of them was Big Baba Popo and one was Little Baba Popo. I'm not sure which was which. But that wasn't the end of our experiences on the coast. Okay, we went from caves with bats to the ocean as well. And so we had an opportunity to dive in the reefs on the coast. And so here we are, all of us enjoying snorkeling in this bathwater warm, beautiful coast with the reef just, inches away from our faces. Absolutely magical experience. So for many of us, this was the first time that we had snorkeled on reefs like this. It was the first time that we had seen up close this kind of biodiversity. I got close enough to this triggerfish because it attacked me over and over. Turns out triggerfish, do you guys know triggerfish? They do that. You can see all of these other fish are really scared and everything, and I'm swimming along and this fish is just looking at me, eyeballing me, And I'm like, what the hell? And I start getting closer and closer and it comes over and just starts attacking me. So other activities that we did along the coast, we did a wonderful forest walk in the Arabuko-Sukoke forest. We engaged in a lot of biodiversity. We saw a variety of things here, including elephants. We got into some elephants again. And we even saw elephant shrews. These are sengis, not related to elephants. I never in my life thought I would see an elephant shrew. These are weird little relatives of tenrecs. And here we were seeing these amazing elephant shrews as well. So another activity, we went and saw these exceptionally rare owls. I don't know owls or birds real well, but apparently these were quite rare, and we managed to see them up close and personal. Got some great pictures of them. One of the last activities we did also was bird related. We did some bird banding with and collected data from some birds that we misnetted for at Arosha. And it was a very interesting experience. Our last adventure included a trip out to the Tana River, where we saw two different types of monkeys, the Tana River mangabe and the Tana River red colobus. Both of these monkeys species are exceptionally rare. There's fewer than 1,500 examples of each of these species along the Tana River. And these were worthy monkeys. They kind of did their own thing, minded their own business, and we had a really nice time seeing them. Ernie almost got arrested on the way out. He didn't bring his passport. And we thought he was going to be we were going to have to go on without him. But it actually worked out just fine. But he does have problems. He has issues with other primates as well, including Sykes monkeys. The Sykes monkeys at Arosha were really aggressive. In fact, we would be eating lunch and monkeys would come in the building, steal stuff off of the tables, and jump out again. And Ernie almost came to fisticuffs with one of the monkeys. They were incredibly aggressive and kind of unpleasant creatures. But our time in Arosha was almost up as well. I want to point out something here. You may have noticed that illustrations and writing throughout my talk. One of the students' assignments was to keep a sketchbook and a journal for the trip. So students had art and writing assignments along the way. And many of them kept a travel journal and wrote their reflections and their thoughts about various things that they were seeing along the way. I also want to note that many of the pictures, probably most of the pictures in here, were taken by the students. So everybody was taking a lot of great pictures and did a wonderful job with that. I hope you can appreciate the integrated experiential approach that we took here and the intensity of the encounter with Kenya that we had with the students. I like to think that these activities may have been truly transformative for the students. I like to think that we stimulated their curiosity and their wonder, and I hope that they will be better biologists and better people because of it. And I think we hopefully achieved our goals. It's really hard to measure something like this. I'm thinking that it might take years, but that the proceeds from this adventure, this experience, may pay off in many ways in the future through these wonderful students. After a couple weeks in Kenya, it's time to finally return home. Flights and layovers were pretty rough, but I think that by this time, our little experiential biology tribe, our little community, we're getting along pretty well. So we ended up playing a lot of cards, even did some yoga, which was a lot of fun, and we enjoyed each other on the way home. That was our experience. I do want to thank a few people. I want to thank the people in New Mexico, particularly UNM Biology. Our administrative people here were instrumental in making this happen, and they did an amazingly wonderful job. I want to thank UNM Global Education, their office, also the UNM Regents Scholarship Committee, and finally the UNM Study Abroad Allocation Committee. These were the people who helped pay for this trip. I want to thank the people of Africa as well, especially the folks at Edu Africa, in particular Zara Cocker and Lincoln Najiru, but everybody was so amazing on their team and really put together an absolutely wonderful trip. Finally, I want to thank the students. This was an absolutely fantastic, amazing group of students. None of them complained, even though they were sunburned beyond belief. They muscled through illness, jet lag. They did everything we asked of them. And they bought into, I think, what we were trying to sell, which was experience. And I am just so grateful. I don't know if we just got lucky. I'm not sure how it happened, but we got the best students in the world for this trip. And I'm so grateful for that. Finally, I want to thank Baba Popo. Without Ernie's been my best friend for a long time, but he's an amazing field scientist. He's an amazing thinker, and he was amazing on this trip. It wouldn't have been the same without him, and so I'm so grateful to him as well. Be happy to answer any questions you might have at this point. I don't know, I went short, didn't I? That's amazing.